Michael Jordan got a letter from his estranged father, 25 years after his death. Michael Jordan sat alone in his private home office, surrounded by the trophies, plaques, and memorabilia that defined his legendary career. The walls, adorned with images of his triumphs on the court, seemed to close in on him, pressing memories of a life spent chasing greatness. Yet, in the stillness of the room, there was a weight that no championship could ever lift. He sifted through a stack of old papers, the inevitable clutter of a life that had never slowed down. Time had passed, but there were moments, like today, when he found himself reflecting on everything he had been through, the peaks, the valleys, the victories, and the losses. His gaze fell upon a single envelope buried deep within the pile, its brown paper torn at the edges. What caught his attention was the handwriting on the front, distinct and unmistakable. His heart skipped a beat. It was his father's handwriting. James Jordan Sr. had been tragically murdered 25 years ago. The murder was senseless, a crime that robbed the world of a man who had been a guiding light for his son's success. Michael had never fully recovered from the loss, never got the answers or closure he needed. Their last conversation had been a strained exchange, the weight of unspoken words lingering between them. The letter in his hand was impossible. How could this have arrived after all this time? He stared at it for a moment, hesitant. He had kept his father's memory alive in the form of his lessons, his wisdom, the quiet strength he'd imparted. But a letter from him now, decades after his death, was something he could not prepare for. He tore open the envelope, unfolding the paper within, the faint scent of old ink reaching him as he began to read. The first few lines were shaky, as if written by someone unsure of their own words. But as he read, he realized the message wasn't one of finality or regret, but a last attempt to reach out. A father's apology. I know I don't have much time, and I know I haven't been the father you deserved. There were things I could never say, things I didn't even understand myself, but I need you to know something before it's too late. Michael's breath caught in his throat. He could hear his father's voice in his head, but the words felt foreign now, as if he were trying to reach across the years, trying to speak to him from a place beyond the grave. His father went on, speaking of his pride in Michael, the pride he had kept hidden, and the pain he had lived with every day since their last encounter. There were mentions of things Michael had never known, regrets about missed moments, the inability to make up for the lost time. It was as though his father was trying to explain away the gaps in their relationship, the spaces where silence had taken root. I regret not being there more. I see now how hard that must have been on you. I thought I was doing what was best for you, pushing you to succeed, but I see now I was too distant. You deserved more. Michael felt his pulse quicken. The words tore at him. His father was apologizing for something that had always felt like an open wound, something Michael had buried under layers of success and distractions. His mind flashed back to his childhood, the long hours his father spent working, the trips they never took, the father-son moments that were left unspoken. Michael had spent years trying to fill the void his father's absence had left behind, and now, 25 years later, he was being confronted with a truth he didn't know how to handle. He put the letter down for a moment, sitting back in his chair. The emotions were overwhelming. In all the years since his father's death, he had never expected something like this to come. He had assumed that he would never get closure, that the final chapter of their relationship had been written in tragedy. But now, here it was, a letter that had somehow found its way to him, a message that shook the foundation of everything he had known. For a moment, he was still, staring at the desk in front of him. His father's words rang in his ears. It was hard to digest the fact that, all this time, the man who had been his greatest influence, who had shaped his very identity, had felt like a failure in his own eyes. He had always seen his father as a rock, as someone who had everything figured out. To hear him express regret was jarring, unsettling. Michael's mind wandered back to the moments after his father's death, the whirlwind of grief that had consumed him. He had always believed that his father's death had been the final chapter, that there was no more to say, no more to understand. But now, this letter made him question everything. Was he right to feel so angry at the world? To channel all that pain into his career? Was he wrong to suppress his feelings, to build a wall around himself, thinking he could outrun the grief? The letter's message wasn't just an apology, it was an invitation to understand, to heal. But how could he reconcile the father he thought he knew with the man in the letter? How could he find peace after all these years, after all the victories that had come at the expense of his own emotional turmoil? Michael reached for the letter again, his fingers trembling as he finished reading. His father's final words were simple, yet they carried an emotional weight that was difficult to comprehend. "Don't carry this burden, Michael. You've done more than I ever could have asked. Let go of the past, and know that I love you. Always." He folded the letter back up, placing it carefully on the desk. His hands rested on the edge of the wood, his breath coming in slow, deliberate breaths. He didn't know what to feel. He didn't know what to do next. All he knew was that this letter, this final connection with his father, had shaken him to his core. It was as though a door had opened to a room he had long since closed. After a few minutes of silence, Michael stood up and walked toward the window. The sun had begun to set, casting a golden light across the city. He didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he realized something fundamental. No matter how far he had come, no matter how many championships he had won, he would always be a son trying to make sense of the absence of his father. And now, more than ever, he understood that closure was not something that could be earned through achievement. It was something that had to be given, even from beyond the grave. And for the first time in years, Michael Jordan felt like he had a chance at peace. Michael stood at the vault's heavy door, his hands trembling slightly as he turned the cold, metal handle. Inside, behind the vault's thick walls, was the safety deposit box that had been in his family for years. His father had always kept it, a place for things he didn't want to lose, things he wanted to keep out of reach. Michael hadn't been back to this vault in years, not since his father's death. The room felt heavy, almost oppressive, as he stepped inside, the cold concrete floor echoing beneath him. The box was tucked away in a corner, a metal drawer lined up neatly with others, each containing the history of the family, papers, legal documents, photos. Michael's hand hovered over the drawer for a moment before pulling it open. Inside was a mix of documents, things that held no particular meaning to him, but then he spotted something familiar. It was an old leather-bound folder, one that immediately took him back to a time when life was simpler, when he was just a young boy, trying to understand who his father really was. The leather folder was worn, frayed at the edges, but it was unmistakable. His father's handwriting was on the front. For Michael, it read. A pang of guilt shot through him. How many times had he ignored these reminders? How many times had he buried his feelings in the pursuit of success, thinking that championships and awards could fill the hole in his heart? He took the folder from the box, the weight of it heavier than he expected, and walked over to a nearby table. He sat down, his hands shaking as he opened it. The first thing that fell out was a letter, folded and yellowed with age. It was his father's writing again, but this one was different. This one wasn't just an apology or a reflection, it was raw. It was everything his father had never said, everything that had been left unsaid in their strained relationship. Michael's eyes scanned the first few lines, his throat tightening. Michael, if you're reading this, I am no longer here, but I need you to understand the weight of everything I've carried with me. The words hit him like a truck. His father had written this at a time when he was still alive, still trying to put the pieces together, still trying to make sense of everything they hadn't shared. Michael felt the ground shift beneath him. He could feel the guilt, the regret in his father's words, but he could also feel something else, a desire for forgiveness. The kind of forgiveness Michael never thought he'd get, not after all these years. The letter went on to describe things Michael had never known, the burdens his father had carried in silence. The pressure to be both a father and a figure of strength, the times he'd failed to show up, the choices he'd made that he regretted. His father wrote about how his career, his ambitions, had clouded the most important thing, being present. Being there for his son. It was a bitter truth Michael had spent years suppressing, one that he had buried in the hustle of his career. As he read, the layers of anger, confusion, and abandonment that had always lingered inside him began to unravel. Michael had always assumed that his father's absence was a result of being busy, of his own desire to make it big. But now, as he read through the letter, he realized that his father had been fighting his own battles, trying to reconcile his own failures and guilt. The realization was a gut punch. It was more than just the absence of a father, it was the absence of understanding, of the things that went unsaid. The letter continued, and with each line, Michael felt a shift within him. His father's words were laced with love, regret, and a deep, almost desperate desire to make things right. There were things Michael had never known, things that could have changed everything between them. But now, it was too late. It was the truth he had always avoided hearing, but the truth he needed to hear. The truth that his father had loved him more than anything, but had been too consumed with his own guilt to show it. The weight of those words pressed down on Michael, making him feel like a child again, small and vulnerable. It wasn't just the letter that hurt, it was the realization that everything he had built, everything he had fought for, had been a reaction to that pain, that loss. The greatness he had achieved wasn't just for the love of the game, it was for the love he had never truly received. After finishing the letter, Michael sat there in silence. The room was still, the only sound the soft hum of the air conditioner. The man who had shaped him, who had given him everything, had left behind not just a legacy of strength, but a legacy of regret. But it wasn't just his father who had lived with regret, it was Michael too. The years of pushing forward, of burying his emotions beneath the weight of his successes, had left him with his own baggage. The anger, the unresolved pain, it had all been there, festering beneath the surface. For the first time, Michael allowed himself to feel the weight of it. He let himself mourn the loss, not just of his father, but of the relationship they never had. He allowed himself to grieve the things that had been left unsaid, the years of silence that had taken root between them. There was no championship that could fill that hole. No victory that could erase the truth that had been buried for so long. As he sat there, holding the letter, Michael made a decision. He wasn't going to keep running from the past. He couldn't change it, but he could face it. He could accept it, and maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to let go of the anger that had been consuming him for so long. He wasn't the perfect son, just as his father hadn't been the perfect father. But they were both human, both flawed. And in that moment, Michael realized that maybe that was enough. He placed the letter back in the folder and closed it. The vault door, once a barrier to his past, now felt like a symbol of closure. He could never get his father back, but maybe he could find peace. Maybe, for the first time in his life, he could finally let go. Michael stood up and walked toward the vault door, the weight of the letter still lingering in his chest. He didn't know what the next step was, but he knew one thing for sure, the past no longer had a hold on him. It had taken years of distance and success to come to this moment, but Michael Jordan was ready to face the truth. And that, in itself, was a victory. Michael Jordan stood in his home office, the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor. The letter from his father, the one that had shaken him to his core, was now carefully folded and tucked into the leather folder. His thoughts were still a whirl of emotions. The words on that page, his father's voice, still strong even from beyond the grave, had unraveled something deep inside of him, something that he hadn't been able to acknowledge for years. For the first time, he felt a sense of clarity that had eluded him all his life. He had always believed that his relentless pursuit of excellence was the answer, that basketball was the only way to overcome the pain of his past. But now, he saw it wasn't about escaping the past, it was about accepting it, understanding it, and ultimately finding peace with it. The phone rang, cutting through the silence of the room. Michael glanced at the caller ID. It was his son, Jeffrey. "Hey, Jeff. What's up?" Michael answered, trying to sound normal, though his mind was still far away. "Dad, I was thinking about you," Jeffrey said, his voice full of warmth. "I was wondering if you'd come by the game tonight. The team's been practicing hard, and I could really use you there." Michael smiled softly. His son, the one who had always looked up to him, who was now carving his own path in the world of basketball, had always been a reminder of the legacy he carried. But tonight, it wasn't about legacy. It wasn't about being the greatest basketball player to ever live. It was about being a father. "I'll be there," Michael said, the words coming easily. He didn't hesitate. The truth in his heart felt so clear now. His family was his legacy, not just the championships. The connections he had built, the people who mattered, were the true measure of his success. As he hung up the phone, Michael took a deep breath and walked to the window. Outside, the world seemed unchanged, yet inside, everything was different. The anger, the resentment, the unresolved grief, it was all still there, but it no longer had the power it once did. The letter from his father had given him a new perspective, one that allowed him to let go of the bitterness that had been a constant companion. He turned around, glancing at the familiar objects in the room, the framed photos of his 6 championships, the jerseys, the basketballs. They were all part of his story, part of who he had become. But they weren't all of who he was. His father had been right. He had done more than anyone could have expected, but there was so much more to life than just basketball. In the days that followed, Michael found himself reflecting on his relationships with his family, particularly with his children. He spent more time with them, listening to their stories, sharing in their joys and challenges. He even began to open up about his own experiences, the things he had never shared. He didn't try to be perfect anymore. He didn't need to be. He was human, just like everyone else. Then, a week later, as he sat with his family around the dinner table, a moment of peace washed over him. His kids were laughing, his wife was sharing a funny story, and for once, he didn't feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. He was just Michael. A father. A husband. A man who had finally found balance. It was at that moment, as he listened to the conversation around him, that he realized something profound. The letter from his father hadn't just given him closure, it had given him the opportunity to truly live. To be present. To embrace the imperfections, the flaws, and the moments that truly mattered. The next day, Michael made his way to the gym for Jeffrey's game. The stands were packed with people, the energy electric. As he walked into the arena, his eyes immediately found his son on the court, practicing shots. Michael watched him for a moment, taking in the sight. Jeffrey had a fire in his eyes, the same drive Michael had had at his age. But now, it was different. Michael wasn't looking at his son as the next great basketball star. He was looking at him as a father, full of pride and love. When the game began, Michael sat in the stands, cheering for his son. Every shot, every pass, every play, he was there. He wasn't thinking about records or fame or the game's outcome. He was simply there, in the moment. And when Jeffrey made a game-winning shot in the final seconds, Michael felt a swell of pride in his chest. Not because of the shot, but because of the connection. The bond between father and son that had always existed, but that he was only just starting to truly understand. As the crowd erupted in cheers, Michael stood up, his heart full. His son ran toward him, a wide grin on his face. "I did it, Dad." Michael hugged him tightly. "You sure did. I'm so proud of you." They stood there for a moment, the world around them fading away. It was as if everything had come full circle. The letter from his father had opened the door to healing, to understanding, and now, with his son by his side, Michael felt a sense of peace he had never thought possible. Later that night, after the game, Michael sat down with his family, reflecting on the day. His phone buzzed, and he saw a message from his manager. "We've received a letter. It's about your father." His heart skipped a beat. But this time, it wasn't fear. It wasn't dread. It was just curiosity. He had already found his peace. He had already come to terms with everything. The letter, whatever it was, could only add to the story. He had nothing left to prove, no more demons to fight. As he opened the letter, he read the simple words, "I hope you know how much I loved you, Michael. I'm proud of you. Always." He closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the weight of the words to sink in. It was the final message he had longed for, but it didn't carry the same burden anymore. It was just love. Simple, pure love. Michael stood up, looked around at his family, and smiled. He was no longer the man driven only by the fear of failure. He was no longer the athlete who had used his pain as fuel. He was Michael Jordan, the man who had found balance, who had found peace, and who was ready to embrace the future with open arms. And in that moment, he knew that the greatest victory of all was not the championships he had won, but the family he had built, the relationships he had nurtured, and the man he had become.